Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever noticed patterns in your relationships, like ones that just seem to repeat no matter who you're with? Maybe you find yourself drawn almost like magnetically to a certain type of person. And sometimes, let's be honest, they aren't even good for you.
Right.
Or you kind of look around and realize, hang on, I'm stuck in the same dynamic again. And yeah, it can be painful. You can really feel like there's this, I don't know, powerful, sometimes inescapable force pulling the strings behind the scenes.
And if you've ever felt caught in a cycle like that, you are absolutely not alone. I mean, it's a deeply, profoundly human experience, isn't it? This feeling of being drawn to familiarity, even when that familiarity brings discomfort or even pain.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we've actually got a stack of sources here today that really dive deep into this very things. They look into why we might be drawn to partners who aren't, ideal for us. The surprisingly severe impact these relationships can have. And maybe most importantly, what pathways might exist for finally shifting those deeply grooved patterns. So let's get into it.
Okay, well, it seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? Why would we be drawn to situations or people that hurt us?
Exactly.
The sources we looked at suggest this attraction isn't always conscious. It's not always logical. Sometimes the people who seem unavailable or maybe indifferent or just clearly not right for us, they can feel oddly, intensely compelling.
This is not just like random bad luck then.
No, apparently not. The experts our sources mention point to internal factors playing a really huge role. Things like maybe low self-esteem.
Okay.
Or perhaps holding on to these unrealistic romantic expectations that kind of set us up for disappointment down the line.
Right, those fairy tale ideas.
Yeah. And a big part of it, which is fascinating and honestly a little unsettling, is this idea of the comfort of familiarity.
Ah, okay. Tell me more about that.
Well, even if a situation is painful or you don't feel appreciated, it can somehow still feel comfortable and reassuring if it mirrors interaction patterns you experienced, say, growing up. Your system recognizes it, even if it's unhealthy. It's like a well-worn path, even if it's a path with potholes.
Right, that internal blueprint we carry around. It's powerful.
It really is. And this idea is pretty central to a specific concept the sources introduce. The human magnet syndrome.
Human magnet syndrome. Okay. Sounds intriguing.
Yeah. The theory is basically that certain personality types are almost like pathologically drawn to each other, like destructive opposite poles of a magnet, hence the name.
Wow. Okay. So what types are we talking about?
Well, it describes a dynamic where you frequently see what's termed a codependent symbiont.
Okay.
Repeatedly drawn into relationships with someone described as a narcissistic manipulator.
Codependent, symbiont, and narcissistic manipulator. Right, let's break down what the sources actually mean by those terms.
Okay, so the codependent symbiont, as it's described here, is someone who might feel this deep need to constantly sacrifice or give excessively, maybe to feel worthy or valuable. Their sense of self-worth often kind of hinges on being needed or, helping others, sometimes to their own detriment.
Got it. And the narcissistic manipulator.
This type is generally characterized by being self-centered, dominating, and often showing traits we associate with the dark triad.
The dark triad.
Yeah, so that includes things like Machiavellianism, narcissism itself, and often a real lack of empathy, sometimes coupled with thrill-seeking behaviors.
So the dynamic is set up perfectly almost.
Yeah.
One person feels compelled to give and fix.
Right.
While the other feels entitled to take and control. It's like a lock and key.
Exactly. And the sources really emphasize that these types can form what they call a painful but inescapable codependent relationship. And it's not despite their unhealthy traits, but actually because those needs, as twisted as they might be, kind of complement each other. It really does take two to tango, as the saying goes. But it's a deeply unhealthy dance.
It's that perverse compatibility that keeps the whole cycle spinning.
Precisely.
And I think there was a historical example mentioned in the sources, something that really brings this magnetic, almost dangerous pull to life.
Yes, exactly. They use the example of the relationship between the notorious bank robber John Dillinger and his partner Billy Fett.
Oh, right, Dillinger.
Yeah. The source presents Billy Fett as someone drawn into this incredibly perilous life with him. Despite the obvious danger, the outlaw lifestyle, there was this intense connection. And it's framed as a kind of classic codependent, drawn to the charismatic, cunning, maybe arrogant figure of the narcissist. It illustrates the specific unhealthy attraction in a, very dramatic way.
Wow. And this ties back to a fundamental psychological idea that was mentioned too, right? Something about repetition.
Yeah, compulsive repetition. It's seen as a powerful driver for why we might find ourselves repeating these painful relationship patterns, often without really understanding why we're doing it.
Totally.
And the answer, the sources suggest, lies deep in our past experiences.
Which leads us straight into the profound role that childhood plays in setting up these patterns, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Our sources really emphasize that our early life experiences, especially if they were marked by things like chronic neglect, rejection, abuse, or even just subtle misattunement from caregivers, they don't just influence our adult relationships, they fundamentally shape them, often way outside of our conscious awareness.
So it's in those really early years that we learn, at a very core level, what to expect from others in relationships, how our needs will or maybe won't be met.
Precisely. It's where our basic understanding of closeness, intimacy, vulnerability, dependency, all that stuff gets formed. It's like our first programming for connection, and it creates this powerful internal blueprint.
And we sort of internalize aspects of those early relationships, like the way our parents acted, how we felt. Those become these internalized images that shape how we see ourselves and others later on.
Absolutely. This internal landscape gets filled with all sorts of conscious or unconscious fears, anxieties, hopes, dreads, you name it. And these deep-seated feelings inevitably, whether subtly or overtly, influence who we find ourselves drawn to as partners. We might seek out people who, on some unconscious level, feel familiar.
Oh, familiar, even if it's bad for me.
Exactly, because they might mirror or somehow complete those early internalized relationship dynamics we experienced.
And the sources connect this directly back to the roots of that human magnet syndrome, right? Saying both the codependent and the narcissistic patterns often stem from a fundamental lack of consistent love and attention in childhood.
Yes, particularly in those crucial early years, maybe 0 to 4. This lack prevents the development of a really healthy, stable sense of self-worth.
Wow.
And there's a really striking idea mentioned here called the emotional baton.
The emotional baton. What's that?
It suggests that parents unconsciously pass down their own unresolved issues, their personality traits, even the patterns of their trauma to their children.
Like an inheritance.
Sort of, yeah. The children then unknowingly mimic these behaviors and dynamics, and it perpetuates the dysfunction across generations. One source even grounds this by briefly mentioning their own family history, showing how these patterns can ripple through time.
Wow, that's a powerful visual. An emotional baton being passed down, maybe without anyone even realizing it. So how do those specific roles, the codependent and the narcissist, start to form based on these early experiences?
Well, the sources explain that children who later develop into codependence might become people pleasers early on, almost as a survival strategy.
Okay.
They learn to hide their true feelings, become incredibly adept at reading subtle cues from others to anticipate needs or, avoid conflict. They might develop habits of self-blame or even lying sometimes, essentially trying to gain attention and care by cooperating with or managing their parents' manipulation or unpredictable behavior.
So survival skills that become kind of maladaptive coping mechanisms later in life.
Exactly. And for those who might develop narcissistic traits, the sources suggest it's often a different kind of defense mechanism, maybe against early abuse or feeling constantly belittled.
Right.
They might develop indifference and a lack of empathy as a kind of protective shield. Sometimes they mimic controlling parents. They might even create this sort of delusion of importance or superiority to cope with the painful reality of feeling insignificant or criticized early on.
So the core takeaway here seems to be that both the codependent and the narcissistic manipulator aren't just randomly problematic people. In the framework of these sources, they're essentially repeating childhood dynamics. They're seeking that pathological familiarity.
Yes.
Unconsciously trying to resolve early pain, often by seeking love or validation from someone who's fundamentally incapable of giving it in a healthy way because, well, they're stuck in their own patterns from their past too.
Which brings us to the undeniable and often really devastating real-world impact of being caught in these kinds of toxic dynamics.
Yeah.
Our sources really lay this bare, drawing heavily from research, including a study specifically focused on partners of individuals with psychopathic traits, which is sort of a piece of this larger puzzle.
That sounds like an intense study.
Yeah.
What did it reveal about the methods used by manipulators in these relationships?
Well, it highlighted that they can be incredibly charming initially, often described as highly loving and attentive right at the beginning.
The love bombing phase, maybe?
Could be, yeah. They're skilled at detecting vulnerability in others, and they're adept at mimicking emotions, even things like remorse, to keep their partners hooked and manipulate them into staying despite the harm being done.
That initial charm must make it so incredibly confusing and painful later on.
Yeah.
Makes it even harder to recognize or leave, I imagine.
Absolutely. And the study paints a really stark picture of the severe consequences for the victims, the partners. It found significant negative impacts across, well, pretty much everything: physical, emotional, cognitive, well-being.
Okay, let's break that down. What kind of toll are we talking about emotionally?
Emotionally, the rates of PTSD and depression symptoms among partners were alarmingly high.
Wow.
This included intense anxiety, fear, panic attacks, paranoia. Also deep feelings of anger, guilt, shame, denial, grief, and tragically, suicidal ideation and even attempts were reported too.
That's just devastating to hear. What about the physical side? Did it manifest physically?
Yes, the sources note a strong link between this kind of chronic high-stress relationship and physical health issues. Participants reported somatic problems, things like digestive issues, chronic headaches, increased heart and respiratory problems, autoimmune diseases, nervous system disorders, even reproductive health problems. And disturbingly, physical injuries were also part of the picture for some.
So the constant emotional and psychological stress literally makes people sick.
It appears so, yes. And behaviorally or cognitively. Big changes there, too.
Like what?
Victims reported significant issues: difficulty sleeping, problems with eating, neglecting their own self-care. Sometimes substance abuse became a coping mechanism.
Oh, dear.
Withdrawing completely from friends and social activities. Cognitively, they struggled with concentration, memory issues, experiencing flashbacks, and just persistent rumination about the relationship, constantly replaying events in their minds.
And how does this damage their ability to connect with other people even after they manage to get out of the toxic relationship?
It causes profound interpersonal damage. A fundamental loss of trust in other people becomes really common.
I can imagine.
They often constantly question their own judgment. Was I crazy? Did I imagine that whole thing? Leading to intense feelings of loneliness and isolation. And understandably, significant difficulty forming future close, trusting relationships. Their capacity for safe connection gets severely compromised.
And there was a term the sources used. Something about experiencing multiple types of this abuse.
Yes, that's called polyvictimization.
Polyvictimization, okay.
And the study specifically found that experiencing multiple forms of abuse, whether it was emotional, physical, sexual, financial abuse, or through constant deceit, was a very strong predictor of increased psychological distress. Basically, the more varied the ways they were harmed, the deeper the trauma tended to be.
So, okay, these patterns are incredibly deep-rooted. The impact is severe. It sounds like breaking free must be a monumental challenge. But the sources do offer some insights, right? Some potential pathways towards change. It's not entirely hopeless.
Absolutely not hopeless. While the challenge is definitely significant, the sources do explore ideas for shifting these dynamics. One particularly fascinating perspective comes from a source discussing a concept with roots in Sanskrit philosophy.
Oh, interesting. Tell me about that. What's the core idea there?
Well, it introduces the idea that a person's challenging or difficult behaviors, sometimes referred to as sanskars, which means acquired traits or deep impressions from past experiences.
Sanskars. Okay.
Are seen as a result of their past circumstances and internal programming. The key insight here is that their behavior isn't necessarily directed at you personally. It's more like a manifestation of their history, their own stuff.
Okay, that's a really powerful reframe. So someone's anger, their manipulation, their indifference, it's less about me personally and more about their own internal landscape shaped by their past.
Exactly. And the insight offered here is that our own disturbance, our hurt, our anger often comes not directly from their behavior itself, but from our judgment of their behavior. We get caught up asking, how can they be like this? This is so wrong. But when we can manage to shift our internal state, stop getting so disturbed or judgmental about their sanskars, we can naturally start to radiate a different energy, maybe one of acceptance towards the reality of their state, without necessarily condoning the behavior, of course.
That's a huge shift. It's not about saying the behavior is okay at all, but about taking control of your own reaction to it, managing your internal world first.
Right. The source uses simple examples to illustrate this, like seeing anger in someone else feels different than recognizing that same anger in yourself, right?
Yeah. True.
Or think about a child who's deeply hurt by being called bad. Understanding that their intense reaction comes from a painful past experience associated with that word fundamentally changes how you might respond to their hurt now. It shifts from judgment to a deeper understanding of the source of the behavior or the reaction.
It fosters a kind of compassionate detachment, maybe, seeing the behavior as a symptom of their past, not a personal attack on me right now.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And a source notes that this becomes much easier to do to respect, in a sense, others' acquired difficult behaviors when you have first given that respect and acceptance to yourself. When your own self-worth isn't external, isn't dependent on how others act towards you. Their actions simply don't have the same power to rock your inner state.
That makes so much sense. If your internal foundation is solid, the external storms don't knock you over as easily. So, okay, breaking free from that relationship addiction or that excessive attachment, the sources describe this as a very conscious process.
Absolutely. It requires deliberate, conscious effort. The sources outline some practical steps people can take.
Like what kind of steps?
Things like cultivating positive thinking about oneself, consciously valuing your own existence, reminding yourself, I am a special person, valuing your time and energy.
Okay.
Learning to accept others' differences without needing them to change for you, actively building new, healthier friendships and social connections, engaging in hobbies and activities that really nourish you.
Right, focusing inward.
And crucially, gradually practicing distance from the unhealthy dynamic. Baby steps maybe, but consistent ones.
It sounds like a process of deliberately recentering your life on yourself and your own well-being, rather than keeping the focus on the other person or the toxic dynamic.
Yes, exactly. And connecting this to therapeutic approaches, the sources suggest breaking free often involves distinct stages.
Stages?
Yeah. There's often a difficult detoxing period, which might require solitude and actively resisting that really strong magnetic pull to return. It involves deep work to understand the manipulation tactics that were used on you. And vitally, working through and healing those hidden childhood traumas that made you susceptible to that pattern in the first place. It requires building strong self-boundaries.
So it's definitely not a simple flip of a switch. It sounds like it involves deep self-work and establishing very firm limits.
Exactly. And the sources are very clear about why it's so incredibly hard. It feels magnetic. It feels almost impossible to leave because, as we discussed, it is pathologically familiar.
Right, that familiarity again.
It's like a drug addiction, really. Trying to break free can trigger severe withdrawal symptoms, intense longing, confusion, self-doubt, the powerful urge to go back to the known, even if the known is painful. The sources even share the example of a patient named Teresa who, despite understanding the dynamic intellectually in therapy, repeatedly found herself drawn back into harmful relationships. It really illustrates just how powerful that unconscious familiar pull can be.
Wow. That story really brings home the immense challenge, doesn't it? Even when you have the awareness.
It does, but the fact that these sources identify specific concepts like the Sanskrit perspective, and they detail practical steps and outline stages of healing, it does offer a clear, albeit challenging, path forward. For those who are ready to do the significant self-work that's required.
And that feels like a really necessary point of grounding for us now, actually. We've journeyed through the deep, often unconscious roots of why we might be drawn into these difficult relationships, linking it back to childhood experiences and those powerful familiar patterns. We've looked pretty unflinchingly at how devastating the impact can be, laid out so starkly in the sources. And yet, we've also explored that there are pathways to understanding, to regaining control, and ultimately, to changing these dynamics.
And recognizing these patterns, whether it's in yourself or your relationships, or maybe even seeing them play out around you, it isn't a sign of failure. Not at all.
Oh.
It's actually a courageous and incredibly powerful first step towards conscious choice, towards breaking those deeply ingrained cycles.
Definitely. It's about shining a light on those hidden forces, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you can begin to actually steer your own course towards healthier connection.
Which leaves us with this thought to maybe ponder. If our earliest experiences really do shape who we are drawn to, sometimes leading us to unconsciously repeat these painful cycles with people who feel familiar, even if they're harmful. What does it truly take, at the deepest level, to consciously choose connection outside the magnetic, sometimes destructive pull of the past?